Okay, so oh dear, I don't know how to. Let me start. I'll turn my camera off in a few minutes because I think that makes it easier to see the slides. This, in a sense, follows the theme that Paul was talking about the sustainability of public transport into the future. The presentation that I'm going to give today was given in an extended form to the International Transport Forum Roundtable on integrating public transport into mobility as a service. And I did that last year with John Nelson, who's the current chair of public transport at the University of Sydney. As many of you will know, the interest in MaaS has been developing over recent years and is informed by people from all around the world, particularly those who've been involved in rolling out practical MaaS trials, because they've helped us develop our intellectual understanding of MaaS. And for all those people that have been involved, I'd really like to offer my thanks. In terms of today, let me turn the slides off, the video off, it's easier to concentrate. This is the introduction. Transport policymakers throughout the world, and that's one of the things we've been talking about, are promoting more sustainable mobility. And we've heard various aspects about that today. In some cases, it is depressingly lip service to the idea of sustainable mobility. But really the twin problems that we have of environmental pollution from internal combustion engines on the one hand, congestion and climate change imperatives on the other, means that we must start thinking about alternatives to the private car, and the private car in particular. Now, before the pandemic, mobility as a service, or MaaS, was widely heralded as the solution for the future. It was thought that individuals could take out a mobility subscription in much the same way as we take out a mobile phone subscription, choosing a mix of mobility modes to suit themselves. So they might choose train, car share, bikes, in much the same way as with our mobile phones. We choose a scheme or a bundle that bundles minutes, texts, and data. In this world pre-pandemic, public transport was thought to be central to the idea of MaaS, with the other modes linking into public transport seamlessly. And it was thought that MaaS could be used to replace the private car because the service that MaaS could provide with seamless mobility would be equally convenient. Alongside bundles, people started to research and offer in practical ways pay-as-you-go options. And from the stated preference work that has been done around the world and some limited pilots that we've seen also, it's clear that pay-as-you-go options are probably preferred to the bundles. What I want to talk to you about today is a little bit one part of this big picture. I want to talk to you about what MaaS is, but most importantly, what are the implications for public transport operators? Are we likely to see those MaaS schemes put in place, or will we see MaaS fizzling out in much the same way as we've seen the MaaS pilots around the world fizzling out too? And in the sense that public transport needs to be at the centre of offers, it's important to see what the business implications are for public transport operators. So I'm going to start by looking at a definition for MaaS and move on from there. One of the things that happens with new areas of study is that lots of definitions come up. So taking the definition from the book that we've written, I want to highlight that any MaaS offering must have three main elements. And if it doesn't have these three main elements, it's not, in my mind, mobility as a service. So first of all, and these are highlighted in red, the user must be at the centre of the offer. Secondly, the mobility offers that the user faces must come from a multimodal offering. So a single mode just doesn't make mobility as a service. And thirdly, and this is the point where many pilots and MaaS pretending offers have come unstuck, is it must be integrating information, payment, and ticketing options. Now, because I'm talking about business models, I think it's important also to talk about definitions here. This slide highlights the three main critical areas that constitute an understanding of business models. First of all, it's important to recognize that a business model is about providing opportunities that give value creation. And so any business model is designed to value add. Secondly, mobility markets are much more complex than the typical goods and services because there are spatial aspects to transportation in the way that doesn't feature in other goods and services markets. And this spatial aspect can be used as a way of achieving competitive advantage and using ways of gaining concentration in the market that excludes operators. The third aspect, and this is at the bottom, is that business models are critically dependent on the stakeholders that are part of that ecosystem. And you can see here, particularly in terms of the stakeholders, there could be a long list of stakeholders, not all of them having quite the same aspirations for outcomes. Of course, the last point is the one that I'm really going to dwell on in this presentation, and it's the organizational frameworks which underpin the governance, which will also make an impact on the business model for public transport operators. And so, to keep the presentation relatively short, I want to draw on a framework that was done earlier by the International Transport Forum and considers 4 governance arrangements which are designed to cover a spectrum of possibilities. You can see in these first 3 diagrams here that there are 3 levels. At the bottom, there are the mode operators, and I've put 4 here really just as examples. In the middle is the integrator or the platform operator, which combines these 4 different modes, 4 in this case, but more if there are more, and offers these to the citizens or the users at the top. You can see that there are 3 relatively similar types of organization here, and one which is called MaaS, which is different. So in the walled garden, sorry, I don't know why this has happened. In the walled garden, in the first one, what you have is platform operators here negotiating with mode operators on the one hand and with citizens and users on the other. Typically, it's a closed system, and the platform operators in this case would be private sector commercial operators. And the examples of this are Helsinki, where WIM operates, and many of you will have heard of that, but also in Singapore in the trial, which has recently come to an end. In the second case here, the public MaaS, it looks very similar, except the integrator role here is the public transport authority or the public transport operator. So you have an extra layer in here, and this is how it's been organized in Oslo and Berlin. In the regulated utility MaaS, you still have a public authority present, but what they're doing is regulating the platform where the aggregators work. And they in turn, as you can see here, will negotiate with the user. The final one, MaaS, looks quite different. And it's not actually proven in the market, although there's been a trial in the Netherlands. If it's successful, you can see by looking at the picture that there isn't really a role for a single aggregator as we have in here, or multiple aggregators here, but there isn't a single aggregator layer. The user in this case negotiates with the mode operator directly, and blockchain is used to process automatic transactions between the users and each of the multimodal operators. Now, one of the problems with looking at a business model for MaaS is that whilst there's a common goal for people to be part of the business model process and capture the value that that might create, stakeholders will enter with different objectives. And if MaaS is going to contribute to increasing sustainability for us, then you need to have public transport as the centre of its delivery. And that's calling to what Paul was talking about before, in the sense of how crowding has led to a better environment for people to travel in, I think, in Chile, but we still need to find a way of actually taking more people on public transport if we're going to achieve sustainability aims. And there's also a question of whether there is room for non-transport operators to seek new opportunities in the MaaS ecosystem. Is a question of whether or not there's sufficient value add for them to do so. But if they did, this could actually provide a value add to the mobility offer for the individuals. If we look at each of these different models and look at the implications of the different organizational forms, the first one, the walled garden, doesn't seem to me to have much difference to the current situation. In terms of a business model, if we look at it from the operator point of view, their world won't have actually changed, although their master will now be the aggregators rather than perhaps the government. In the public MaaS, again, little will change in terms of the public transport operators. The only thing perhaps that might change is that the centre aggregator here might demand different forms of mobility contracts, and perhaps demand, as we've been seeing in other areas, mobility contracts which are certain amounts of mobility that can be delivered in different ways. And in this case, these mobility operators might need to get smarter about how they meet those contractual obligations. In this regulated mobility situation, I can't see that there would be much difference, in the sense that if the government is regulating the platform, then you'd expect them to regulate it in a way that mirrors their own behaviour, and so the rules of engagement are likely to be similar. The biggest change to business models will come from Meshy MaaS if it happens, and as we'll see in a bit further on, this could create quite a different world for public transport delivery, because you miss out that intermediary stage. And all four models, however you look at them, will need some way of allocating revenue from the user to the individual mobility providers that sit at the bottom and have integrators in the middle. And how you reallocate revenue between these mode operators is something which is current research active. One of the issues for a mobility as a service, or MaaS, is that when you have a mix of mobility operators, then you've got a mix of subsidized and market provided modes. And the aggregators will need to learn how to deal with this, because taxis, for example, Uber, car share are marketly provided, whereas public transport will always have some sort of subsidy. So we need to look at how subsidy might change under the MaaS business model. And so the next slide looks at different types of subsidy and then consider how this might change in a MaaS development. Typically, subsidies are divided into supply-side subsidies on the one hand and demand-side subsidies in the other. What we see in public transport is most commonly supply-side subsidies. And in lots of ways, they are inherently problematic. If you give supply-side subsidies, network or even direct route subsidies, they typically, as we've seen in research, don't have good equity outcomes. And research has also shown that these subsidies can be regressive and tend to favour urban rather than regional services, or in very dense cities, the central rather than the suburban areas. Leaving aside concessional fares, there are a number of demand-side subsidies, and the two that I just want to talk about briefly are incentive payments per passenger, whereby the operator or the integrator in MaaS would get a certain amount of subsidy for each person that was travelling. And the second, well, and I think I ought to acknowledge here that this is a sort of demand supply-side subsidy based on demand. Whereas the second one, this person-centred payments, are true demand-side subsidies and could be targeted to need. So you actually give the subsidy to the individual and let them choose how they would spend it. And scaling up these person-centred subsidies has always been an issue, but it could be tied to the taxation system. In practice, the incentive payment per passenger has a number of practical advantages, especially as now it's very easy to count passengers on vehicles. And giving individual incentive payment passenger subsidies would be really good if you end up in a meshy MaaS type situation where individuals contract separately with the operator. Am I doing all right for time, Ricardo? 5 minutes, another few minutes.
Can you wrap it up in 3-4 minutes?
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
So coming to looking at MaaS, if MaaS remains niche as it is at the moment, it's difficult to see how the subsidy options will change. You can make contracting more incentive-based, but there isn't really the role when only a small number of people are travelling with mobility as a service to change to more demand-side subsidies, which are likely to give you greater equity and direct subsidy as to where you want. If MaaS becomes scaled up, then there are options, I think, for further subsidy that would help develop the sustainability outcomes. In the walled garden case, you could still stick to the same system, but there's an incentive for aggregators to lack the ability to scale up. And also, if you have supply-side subsidies, you can't reward good behaviour. Whereas with incentive payments, you can give more payments to people if they travel more. The same is true of the public MaaS, but with the extra problem that if you have lower competition, you might also get less innovation and a lack of trust. Here in the regulated utility, you do have some competition, and that will encourage innovation. And with the public MaaS, because the government or the subsidizing body is involved, there is an opportunity to introduce bulk discounts of tickets, which can actually then help channel subsidy to those people who travel more. It breaks the boundaries if we end up in meshy MaaS, And this allows us to link subsidy to behaviour change. So you can give more subsidy to people who travel more by public transport or who use sustainable modes to complete their journeys. So what we've seen here is that if MaaS remains niche, it's not going to contribute to sustainable outcomes. It's unlikely to contribute to travel behaviour change. So that begs the question of what has to happen in order for it to become scaled up. And I would argue that there are three dimensions to scaling up MaaS. It needs to have a big enough area. It needs to cover a labour market so that people travelling to work in particular don't have to change systems halfway round. There needs to be at least 50% of users in that spatial area for you to get scaled up MaaS and be able to make changes. And you need to have all the mobility providers being supplied through at least one aggregator. How long might this take? I don't know. I think that the pandemic has put, if not an end, certainly a slowing to what this might mean. And there's also, as we can see here from the scaling up, there's a requirement to have a transition from where we are now to where we might end up. And it's difficult to know. I mean, the rhetoric that came with MaaS at the beginning was that it would allow travellers to travel around the world with the single package that they had. What the trials have shown us is that this is likely to be much more context specific and therefore adding to the difficulties of a transition period. And finally, does COVID-19 mean that MaaS is now a dream? A number of presentations, and Paul showed it as well, showed that public transport had a dramatic fall in patronage and associated with that, a big fall in revenue. As it's always been argued that public transport must be the backbone of MaaS, any decline in public transport use and consequential changes in provision will have an effect not only on MaaS rollouts, but also on public transport operators. So that's the depressing side of it. The more helpful or the more optimistic side of it is that maybe MaaS could help public transport recover. If you look back to the definition of MaaS and the three criteria that need to be fulfilled, then MaaS platforms could actually facilitate a booking system for public transport. It could apply different fares and priorities for different travellers, and it could show travellers when services are busy and allow them to be booked in that way, thus restricting the amount of crowding that you see. And it might also be the case that non-mobility operators join in and also boost the vitality of the MaaS system. So I would say that MaaS is certainly in crisis, but I don't think it's quite dead yet. So that's me, over.
Thank you, Corinne. I will open for questions. I don't know, here. I wanted to ask you about this Meshi, how do you call it?
Meshi MaaS.
Meshi MaaS. How do you envision this with few companies, with many? Because I think that the possibility of having natural monopolies are really certain in this type of business.
Well, I think one of the advantages of Meshi MaaS is that the contracts are actually between the individual user and the mobility operator. So the advantage of that is that you can actually target subsidy to those groups of individuals that you want to subsidize. But you're right, the other side of the coin is that if these operators are released from regulatory control, they can use their spatial dominance to create a monopoly and therefore make it more expensive for all users. But I think that most governments are sufficiently concerned about the arrival of MaaS, although I'm not sure that they should be so worried about it, that they would have that regulatory side of the problem resolved. But it's still, but blockchain as a everyday activity is still, I think, something for the future.
Anything else, Juan Carlos?
Thank you, Corinne, for your talk. How do you compare the MaaS the MaaS system with pay-as-you-go, in which, well, people, why do we need this if we may have pay-as-you-go, in which people will pay an amount of a ticket depending on maybe the cost of the modes they're actually using at the time they're actually using, in the direction they're actually using, in which you could even consider the marginal cost of each of them, and maybe consider that on some directions the trip is actually for free, while in others it can be quite expensive. So I am always skeptical of the MaaS, since I don't understand why would this be preferable from the pay-as-you-go system.
Well, I think the pay-as-you-go system under MaaS would still be mobility as a service. It would still be the payment of a single ticket from your origin to your destination, irrespective of the number of modes you take, rather than a bundle. I can understand why travelers might prefer pay-as-you-go, but I can also understand why aggregators might prefer bundles. And most of the mobile phone operators that we have around the world make their money out of the minutes, the texts and the data that people don't use. And they use that to cross-subsidize those minutes and texts which are used. And the same would be true of mobility operators. So yes, I can understand why individuals would want pay-as-you-go, but I think it's different from pay-as-you-go that we see at the moment, where you might actually pay for a taxi for the first mile, then your metro, and then your bus, and then your final destination. But you shouldn't push me too hard about the benefits of MaaS, because I think it's probably not going to happen.
Fine.
Thank you, Juan Carlos.